El siguiente evento de Cátedra Europa es transmitido a través de Uninorte Académico en YouTube. Suscríbete y accede a otros eventos de la cátedra.
Good morning. It's nice to have you all here with us. My name is Haniel Melamed. I'm a PhD in International Security and an assistant professor here at the Department of Political Science and International Relations in the Universidad del Norte in Barranquilla, Colombia. This event has been organized within the special framework of Cátedra Europa, or Forum on Europe in English. For those of you who are not familiar with Cátedra Europa, well, let me just tell you that it's one of our most iconic events in our university. It takes place every year, and it has been going on like that for 25 years. And this year, we have Finland as our honor country. The main purpose of Cátedra Europa is to allow Universidad del Norte and the Caribbean community to establish academic, social, cultural, and scientific interaction with our European and international counterparts in order to enrich our own culture, knowledge, and understanding of the world. Today, we have a great group of people in order to analyze the Ukrainian war and some of the most relevant and current issues from different perspectives. All of our guests are highly respected scholars in their areas of expertise. So let me introduce our friends very briefly. First, we have Dr. Rico Yalkibro. He's a PhD in International Relations from the University of St. Andrews with a focus on peace, conflict studies, and terrorism studies. He's a graduate of the Gothenburg University and has a master's degree from the Uppsala University. He currently works for the Anwar Gargash Diplomatic School in the United Arab Emirates. Good evening to you, Dr. Ricard. Nice having you on board. We also have Dr. Denis Mirgorod from Russia. He holds a PhD in political science. He is also a professor at the International Relations Institute at the Piatagorsk State University in Russia. He has been a senior research fellow at the Center for International Political Research of the Greater Mediterranean at Sevastopol State University, and is a registered expert at the Russian International Affairs Council. Good evening to you, Dr. Mirgorod. Nice having you on board too. And last but not least, we have with us Dr. Joachim Kleinschmidt. He holds a PhD from Munich University, and is currently a research associate at the Catholic University of Eichstätt, Ingolstadt. I'm sorry, Joshua, I have to practice my German skills. He also teaches in Colombia at the Universidad de Rosario, so he's fully fluent Spanish speaker and has been with us. He's a great friend of Universidad del Norte, and it's a great pleasure to have you on board in this academic event. I welcome you all. Now, I want to begin with the following thought. It's been 234 days since the war started, almost 8 months. In the prior weeks of the beginning of the war, it was very interesting that at the time, Russian tanks and armored vehicles were already assembling near the border with Ukraine. And at that point, it was presented as basically a military exercise. Now, it's been a long time since that. From your own personal perspectives, I would like to know how you think the war is going for each side. Let me begin this question with Dr. Mirgorod, and then we can continue with Dr. Jalkibro and with Dr. Kleinschmidt in that order. Dr. Mirgorod, thanks a lot, and you can begin with your answer.
First of all, let me thank all organizers of this event for the opportunity to speak on such an important and topical issue. And as I understood, I must be very brief to get my general idea. So I decided to speak a little bit about the logic of the Russian politics towards Ukraine and towards the European security and global security. In this case, I should say that from the very beginning of my scientific career, I have been dealing with the problems of formation of regional security systems. So I have my own clear understanding of why the European security system is in such a crisis, especially after Russia launched, and I would like to outline this, not a war, but a special military operation in Ukraine. Yes, I see the reaction, but frankly speaking, this is not a war. This is not a war. In my opinion, the main thing that led to the current crisis and made it possible is that the countries of the West, and especially the United States, continue to live, let's say, in the Cold War binary thinking format, and continue to divide the world according, let's say, to the principle. Oh, I'm sorry. Do you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And continue to divide the world, let's say, according to the friend of four principle. And this principle didn't disappear, unfortunately, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, which actually lost this war. And it also survived during the presidency of our first president, Boris Yeltsin, who proposed many times the beginning of the formation of a common security system with the Western countries. And it also didn't disappear during the presidency of Vladimir Putin, who also was ready for maximum cooperation with the Western world. Such a perception of Russia, such lopsided, one-sided view, the West's complete disregard for the norms of international law led to a situation where the former Soviet republics began to be used to increase pressure on Russia. For example, I'm talking about the most obvious examples, the Baltic states, the South Caucasus, and especially Georgia, and of course, Ukraine itself. And within this framework, I would like to remind you that any major actor in the international arena, I mean, big actor, leading actor in the international arena, has its own zones of their exclusive national interests and encroachments on which pose a real existential threat. That is why the leadership of Russia made this difficult decision to launch, let's say war, but nonetheless it's still a special military operation in Ukraine. In this regard, I have to state that, and this is my personal view as a researcher, in this regard, I have to state that Europe has become a hostage to the ambitions of Washington, which didn't allow European countries to build a safe space on the entire continent, which is objectively impossible without Russia, both in political and military forms, and of course at the economic level, including energy. So at present, the ongoing Atlantization, yes, I mean the case of Finland and Sweden, the ongoing Atlantization of the European regions threatens to plunge the entire European space into a state of permanent crisis for many years to come. So I'm deeply convinced, really deeply convinced, that the future formation, yes, the future configuration of the European security should be based, first of all, upon cooperation with Russia. Yes, that's my main idea.
Thank you, Denis. I appreciate your comments. John, I'm sorry, I said that we were going to go first with Ricard. My apologies. Dr. Jalkabur,
I'm fine if Joshua wants to
your thoughts about how this war is unfolding. I'm sorry?
No, I said if Joshua is ready and wants to go, then feel free.
No worries, no worries. I can follow Ricard.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right. Yes. Thank you. I'd like to just perhaps go back to the original question: how is the war going on both sides? It's a difficult question. Obviously, whether you want to then call it a war or a special operation, I'm more inclined to call it a war. I have to say, but as with any wars, it's not a good situation for either countries, and I think most people have been surprised of what's happened. Actually, the relatively impressive response from the Ukrainian side initially. Obviously, it looked quite dire with the extreme, should I say, over in terms of manpower. Obviously, the Russian armed forces far superior, but
I didn't get that. Could you try again?
Oops, sorry. serious listening apparently. I am in the UAE after all, so I'm sure someone's listening to what I'm saying. And it's interesting because I had this discussion with my students earlier this morning in a lecture discussing the UAE's role and the UAE stance, because I'm also that's why I'm happy. The sooner we finish, I'm heading up to New York tomorrow to interview the UAE mission to the UN as part of the Security Council, to find out and ask them and really try to figure out the way they've been voting in both the General Assembly and in the Security Council and so on. But that being said, sorry for rambling here, but going back to the original question, how is the war going on both sides? I think it's going pretty badly for both in that sense, because it's still an armed conflict and a lot of people are obviously dying on both sides. So in that sense, sadly, it is not going well.
Thank you, Rikard. Jahid, could you add some thoughts to this question? How do you see the things unfolding?
First of all, I'd like to address the entire Spetsoperacja versus war semantic issue. I just sent you a link. It contains information on the law that Dennis, of course, has to obey, which says that if he does call it a war, he goes to jail for 15 years. So we don't wish that on Dennis, but some people have been sentenced to 15 years of jail, and Russian jails are not for the faint-hearted, right? So obviously there are some restrictions on what you can say. In any case, militarily, I see it going badly for Russia, very badly. Russia has lost at least half of its tank force. It has lost at least half of its infantry fighting vehicles. It has lost probably the majority of its highly trained infantry units, like the VDV, the air assault troops, and so on and so on. Increasingly, it depends on mercenary troops, not technically legal mercenaries, but employees of a private enterprise called Wagner, which is part really of a degeneration process that sees Russia becoming more and more like those neo-patrimonial African states, which essentially privatize the application of violence and essentially turn into one giant pyramid of patronage. And that is something that was visible in the evolution of Russian statehood even before the start of the war. And that has clearly been accelerated by the war as the extraction of manpower and so on is simply much more efficient by extra-legal means. And so really I see Russia deteriorating towards what is the norm, really, among states that purely rely on the extraction of natural resources for their wealth generation and also for their political legitimacy. It's a process that is very similar to what Colombians have observed in Venezuela. And really now we must not make the mistake as also Dennis was making, to confuse contemporary Russia with the Soviet Union, right? The Soviet Union was an autarkic, industrialized empire. Russia is a neo-patrimonial extractivist state. And this war is apparently some badly conceived attempt at somehow restoring yesterday's imperial glory. And from what we can see, I mean, obviously there's going to be a lot of suffering in terms of civilians in Ukraine, in terms of Ukrainian infrastructure and so on. But really, Russia, even now, has been reduced to the role, well, it's quite similar to what the Palestinians are doing vis-a-vis Israel. They cannot win against the Israeli military, so they shoot missiles into civilian areas, hoping to inflict some damage, obviously on a much larger scale. But really, when you're being compared to the Palestinian Authority, then I would say it's clearly that your military success is limited, and that you're no longer really a major actor in, at least in conventional military affairs. That would be my initial appraisal of the situation.
Thank you, Josh. Look, I find all your perspective very interesting. And as you know, one of the main reasons this academic event actually came to life, and it's so important for us, is because, as I mentioned before, Cátedra Europa, but not only that, because Finland is our honor country, but we find a very interesting area of analysis on the fact that Finland and Sweden, both nations, have taken steps towards membership of NATO, right? So I would like to go through this path and ask you, how could this measure benefit or alter NATO's and Russian arms capabilities? And this time I would like to begin with Dr. Jalkabro, then we can follow with Dr. Kleinschmidt, and finally with Dr. Milgren. So Rickard, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you. As the half Swede, half Finn, I suppose, take the prerogatory and honoring my home nation. Yes, it is obviously interesting to understand the background and history when it comes to these things. I know it's Finland. I grew up in Sweden, so I have more of a Swedish perspective, but I obviously am fairly well aware of Finnish history and so on. And to trace it back in those terms, obviously there's been a very long-standing history between Sweden and Russia in particular, war-wise and so on, and which is also why we have this notion that we always feared the Russians, as anyone in the vicinity have been for a very long time. And I suppose just a personal anecdote, obviously growing up in this part of the world during the Cold War, we did have a lot of drills and so on annually to in case of nuclear attacks, etc., etc. And I think that this was really a wake-up call to both Sweden and Finland. Obviously, having been neutral since Sweden obviously not being at war since 1809, also the last time we fought the Russians and ceded Finland to become a part of the Russian Empire. So this is the history as well that's also playing up, and Finland most recently obviously fighting a war during the Winter War in '39 and so on, and has a more close history to have been actually engaging in warfare with the Russians and so on. And throughout the Cold War, with the neutrality and Finlandization for Finland's sake and so on, which we really left behind us in the post-Cold War era, when both became not neutral but alliance-free rather. So this has been a very big shift for both Sweden and Finland to actually even consider joining NATO. It has been a standing thing for each new government to actually discuss and debate the NATO question, both in Sweden and Finland. And as per usual, we like to do things together, right? We don't do one thing. Sweden wouldn't do anything without Finland and vice versa. So we joined the European Union at the same time, and we always have a very close relationship, right? So, and I think this was a wake-up call. Sweden, obviously having had a rather formidable armed forces throughout the war periods and the Cold War, decided to scrap conscription in 2009, which is something that so Finland is much better prepared for joining NATO. They've already reached the 2% budget spending and so on. Sweden is a bit further behind, and I think these are the main issues that both. I think that most countries in NATO have already obviously welcomed, and there's still some issues with Turkey and the veto, of course, for various reasons. More so for Sweden, have more issues, and I think Finland is in the clear almost, but Sweden are still hosting the terrorists that are the Kurds and the Gulenists and so on.
Thank you, Rikard. Joachim, your perspective, please.
Yes, well, basically what Rikard said, having worked with NATO for some time, I can add perhaps some internal perspectives. Within NATO circles, it was always common to say, like, if only we had the Swedes and the Finns as members as well, right, we would have a much more solid position geostrategically. And when, for example, when Partnership for Peace cooperation was discussed with Sweden, actually the Swedes said, hey, why should we adopt your standards? Our standards in some cases are much higher, and so on and so on. So what we're gaining really are two extremely capable military forces who have been preparing to defend themselves very competently, who have an important domestic armaments industry. Also, if you look at issues such as magazine depth, right? How many ammunition stores do you have to fight a prolonged war, and so on and so on? That's really where Sweden and Finland stand very tall above their future NATO partners. It's also important to note, I think, that some NATO countries, I remember the UK, perhaps also the US, a number of countries have already given assurances to Finland and Sweden that during the accession process, they would already behave as allies. They were giving security guarantees to Sweden and Finland. So that means that whether they join or not, they already have some very substantial security guarantees. And just as an add-on to what Rikard was saying, I think 2 points are important. One, that over the course of this disastrous war in Ukraine, the Russians have withdrawn many of their most important military forces from the Kola Peninsula, which is the most important base and staging area directly opposite the Finnish border, essentially demonstrating that they don't see a threat from NATO, right? That all of this propaganda of NATO being a problem for Russia was fake, right? As so much of the information that comes out of RT and those different Sputnik and those different propaganda channels. And it also demonstrates that Russia does not have currently any conventional capability to attack in that sector. And finally, also that the reason why precisely it made sense for Finland and Sweden to join, even though it was basically soon demonstrated that they could probably defend themselves very successfully, was that Russia, at least verbally, threatened a non-nuclear weapon state with nuclear weapons, right? Which is such a breach of any implicit or explicit rule among countries that this basically is the rationale to a large degree of their accession to NATO. The nuclear issue plays a big role here, and essentially Putin won the award of NATO Salesman of the Year because he now has what Russia always feared, right? Finland and Sweden, with their substantial military forces and long border and strong national will to defend themselves against Russia, are now allied with NATO, which is a substantial worsening of the Russian strategic situation.
Thank you, Joachim. Dennis, your perspective, please, your thoughts.
Well, each country has its own way and can decide which way to take. But I would like to dispute a bit whether NATO is a threat to Russia or not. If you say that NATO is not a threat to Russia, then Russia is not a threat to Sweden and Finland at all. And this decision, yes, I personally, and as a researcher, I take it, I understand the logic, but nonetheless, it will lead only to the escalation. Yes, I agree with you. Yes, I totally agree with you that this special military operation shown a lot of problems with our army. I'm not a military expert. You told us some dramatic figures. I'm not going to argue about the figures. But nonetheless, yes, this was shown a lot of problems, a lot. And the problem for the European security and for the countries, for the newcomers to NATO, I'm sorry, that the perception of how we shall improve our army is now getting more and more stronger. I don't know whether you heard the last decisions of Mr. Putin, but he decided to change the mechanism of administration, of internal administration. Now we can make very quick decisions in industry, in forming military forces, and so on and so forth. Personally, I really, you send the link here that all Russians who call this not military, special military operation, yes, but war, they in prison. So I should be in prison because for me, for personally, for me, it's civil war that keeps.
Call it a war, Dennis. Call it a war, Dennis. I'll call the cops on you. Yeah, call it a war.
That keeps going.
Call it a war. Call it a war now.
That keeps going after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Yes, and there are a lot of people who call this special military operation a war. Yes, in Russia, and I don't know anyone who is in jail right now. So the situation is getting out of control, and we are on the track of total militarization. And even in countries like Finland or Sweden or any other European countries who didn't get used to be militarized, because Russia, for example, yes, with all problems, I accept it, yes, but during the period from the early 90s, yes, we were ready and we were spending a lot of money, yes, for our army and so on and so forth. And now the whole Europe is getting to this track, the track of militarization. And the problem that I'm how it's better to say, I'm and European centrist. Yes, it means that if we are going to face some dramatic outcomes from all what is going on right now, yes, taking into account also nuclear weapon and so on and so forth, yes, the situation when we have the conflict in Europe can really lead to World War III, unfortunately.
Very interesting, Dennis. Let me try to summarize a few ideas that have been going through my mind while I've been listening to you carefully. And one of the main things that I have to say is that, I mean, probably not Ricard, but Jochen and Dennis, but in any way, anyone who really studies this area of expertise, international security, geopolitics, and the war in Ukraine, even if you don't mention it, you think about it, is the nuclear dilemma, right? I mean, nuclear weapons are right there. Probably not on the table right now, but are right there. I mean, you have nuclear powers confronting directly or indirectly, whatever you want to call it, strong strategic objectives. So as I have gone through, reviewing news papers and in academic journals, and you see that some actors are actually taking this nuclear stance. They do have this nuclear talk. Can we consider this just a threat and that's it, like a show? It's supposed to be like that, just a threat that is, ambiguous and is not really meant to translate into any proper actions? Or should we consider this something else? I truly hope this is just a threat, but again, they are just right there. The nuclear powers confronting each other on European soil. It's not a very crazy scenario that you can believe that in the near future, eventually you can have any sort of international crisis related with this subject. I don't know if I got lost a little bit in translation, but it's a main idea that keeps going through my mind a lot. So I would like to ask you just your opinions about it. Is this just the same type of a scenario that we witnessed when we were those of us who are older than 40 during the Cold War, that, this type of mutual assured destruction dilemma that no one could actually think it was rational to go on with this possibility? Or are we facing some type of new scenario? And I would like to hear your comments on it. Dennis, I think you just mentioned this right up your last comment, but let's go with Ricard. Ricard, what do you think about this? Are we facing the same dilemmas that we faced during the Cold War? Is this something new? Is this just a threat, an empty threat, or there could be something more about it?
I'm a bit worried. I'm usually quite relaxed when it comes to these things, but it's becoming more real, to be honest, because I don't want to throw the crazy card in there, but it's unpredictable in its, it's the unknown knowns and the known unknowns, the Rumsfeld thing. But something I'm worried about is because obviously being Swedish and the Chernobyl, obviously Sweden was the first country to detect it because the downfall and it spread all the way. So Zaporizhzhia is something that's worrying me. Perhaps not nuclear weapons, but what could potentially happen if with the new, it's obviously the biggest nuclear power plant. I think it's a worldwide, it's not just Europe. I think it's the biggest one in the world. And those things are obviously also very catastrophic, but using the weapons itself, and that's what I think what something that Dennis said, that Russia is not the threat, but then again, Sweden and Finland hasn't threatened Russia with anything. They have joined, well, asking to join NATO because Russia threatened them, and when they also applied for the membership, that was when the real threats came in, not overtly. And because it's a long history, right? Of during the Cold War, I was mentioning that I myself had to do drills and hide in bunkers and all of these things in school. So these things have always been present, and I think, yeah, perhaps since the Cuban Missile Crisis, we're closer to it than ever before, because it is being used as a threat, which we haven't really seen in the same way in a very long time, at least. It's always been a possibility, right? But it is worrying. Maybe not the mutually assured destruction, but tactical nukes are at least closer to be used, depending on how the situation goes forward, right? So that's my comment.
Okay, Joachim, could you add some of it? What's your opinion about it? And I will go with Dennis to give you your chance to also give your impressions and to develop it a little bit more.
Thanks. Yeah. I'd encourage you to compare Putin's communicative behavior with Richard Nixon's communicative behavior at the end of the Vietnam War in roughly 1972-73, when he was trying to end the war on his terms, right? He tried hard to convince the North Vietnamese and the Soviet Union that he was close to using nuclear weapons, that he was he had his assistants paint Nixon as a crazy guy who was on the edge and was just shortly before using nuclear weapons. He even had B-52s circling over the Arctic to drive home the idea that this was risky. The Soviets knew about threats and how nuclear weapons are used to create fear and to create a psychological effect, because they obviously had used the same style of communication. It's the exact same thing going on, right? And regarding tactical nukes, I'd like to say at least two things. First, tactical nukes are not very good in the current situation. Right? I mean, obviously they have a devastating effect on the few hundred meters circle surrounding the impact area, but they're not going to produce any decisive battlefield effect. In the Cold War, if it had gone hot and you had like an area like the Fulda Gap, like 200 kilometers from here, where you would have like tank brigades, tank divisions in a very tight, concentrated space, their tactical nuclear weapons could have had battlefield impact, but not right now, where, I mean, the largest maneuver unit that is used at all in the conflict are brigades, and they are used in very dispersed formations and with troops being far away from each other. The Ukrainians even disperse their artillery guns individually. So you don't have like batteries of 6 howitzers, but you have individual guns dispersed over a wide space. So tactical nukes are not going to have a battlefield impact. If they're used against cities, well, you would obviously make yourself such a rogue actor that you would have to face consequences, including even by China. Right? They would not see that as an admissible act. And another consideration is that if Russia used tactical nukes, well, most of the, or at least half of the cruise missiles, etc., that are being sent from Russia to Kiev and other cities are already being shot down, and Ukrainian air defense is going to get better and better with the supply of new systems, NASAMS and IRIS-T, SLM, and so on, by its Western partners. So there is a considerable risk that if Russia actually uses nuclear weapons, that they would be shot down on the way. So that would be an extremely bad situation to be in, right? To have used nuclear weapons and they don't even arrive at their destination. In that case, we would be like an unknown country. So, of course, there is a residual risk, right? Nuclear weapons exist. We should worry about them at least 5 minutes every day. That's what I tell my students. But the current situation is not, I mean, I grew up 5 kilometers from the Iron Curtain. I remember the big reforger exercises and so on during the 1980s as a kid. So we shouldn't be as worried even as we were during the 1980s when nuclear weapons had a discernible military purpose. We should see this as what it is, mostly a psychological strategy. And I mean, Putin is, I personally, I don't believe that Putin is a madman. He has a wrong appraisal of the situation. He has been misled by his advisors. He only reads certain internal intelligence reports that paint a situation that is deeply misleading to him. But he's not going to do crazy things. And even if he did, he would have to go through at least 2 different positions in the Russian Nuclear Release Authority chain. So it's quite likely that that situation would imply a huge risk for him as a person and as a leader, because he would give an immediate incentive to his lieutenants to act against him, because you don't know what's going to happen, right? So there's a paper by the Atlantic Council that if Russia uses tactical nukes, then the US would reply conventionally and in a devastating fashion against the Russian military in Ukraine. And several sources have looked at this possibility as the most likely possibility for a response. That would mean the end of your, I'm going to use the word to make you happy, your special operation, right? Strategic nuclear weapons would be absolutely crazy to use because the fallout would devastate large parts of Russia and would invite also a NATO response, because a nuclear attack on Ukraine would be seen as threatening NATO countries as well. So I'm not worried. The Russians will be defeated. The question is, how does this defeat play out? They're going to lose a lot more of their young men, which are being burned by Putin without any conscience. They are, to a large degree, residents of minority areas like Buryats, Tuvans, etc. That's going to change the internal dynamics of the Russian Federation. And as I said, we're looking at a situation where the Russian state is being disaggregated into different privatized power centers. That's the dynamic we should be looking at. And of course, in that context, we need to say what happens with Russian nuclear weapons, right? Are there going to be Wagner nuclear weapons or whatever? Those are questions that might become real sooner than we imagine. But right now, I'm not worried about tactical nuclear weapons, and I probably talked too long. But
okay, Johan, it's okay. Dennis, do you have anything to add to the discussion?
Just a bit, yes. I agree with Johan that probably it is more rhetorical question, yes, about the probable usage of the nuclear weapon. And I should admit that it's a bit obsolete rhetoric, yes, that was used. So I also tell my students that they shouldn't worry about using nuclear weapon. But I just want to add the thing that unfortunately Ukraine is nothing for the countries that support it. Yes, it's just an instrument for destroying, not destroying, but for the permanent effect, yes, on Russia. And that's why I'm I think, I'm afraid that the territory of Ukraine can be used for some kind of nuclear provocations, just to make Russia reply. Yes.
Okay. Thank you all for your comments. I wanted to take like a small detour from the subject because I know, well, some of you have already mentioned Middle East stuff or arenas or interests. Ricard is right there in the heart of the Middle East right now. He's in United Arab Emirates. Dennis is also an expert on the Middle East, and Jochen also knows the field very well. And there's something that has going through my mind also recently when I just saw these on our unmanned drones that were impacting areas, civilian areas in downtown Kiev or in civilian populations. And, you know, there's this information war also that goes exactly in a parallel field with the military capabilities on the field. And there are some, let's say, analysts who point the finger of Iranian drones actually being provided to the Russian in order to conduct this type of operations, things that are being categorically being denied by the Iranian authorities. And as a consequence of this, you have Ukrainian authorities stating that they are going to ask for, Western or allies to provide them with the technology or military capabilities in order to confront this threat. And that comes Israel, because, Israel and Iran has their own type of scenario going on. So my main questions about this, and I would like to hear your opinions of it. Is this shifting thing? I mean, is this an alliance that is getting stronger? I'm going to explain myself a little bit more. Russia, Iran is something that we could be getting, more strong allies that we saw, for example, in Syria, which at some moments they appear to be, working from the same goal, but eventually they all have their own agendas, right? So how close do they get? How strong is that alliance? And in case you think this is a strong alliance and they work very cohesively, how is this counter alliance shifting and taking form in order to confront them, not only on the Ukrainian area right now, but in other scenarios that go beyond this original area of confrontation? I would like to go first with Jochen right now, which you mentioned first. I'm sorry, you mentioned it before, the Middle East area. So I'll go with you, and then I'll go with Ricard, and we go with Dennis, and we're getting. I have to tell you guys, my inbox is going crazy. I'm getting all these very interesting informations and questions from my students and from my colleagues. They're very happy with our conversation. I'll be trying to summarize some of the questions, the most relevant ones, in order to go to the final part of our conversation. So, Jochen, the floor is yours.
Yeah, would be a lot to talk about, right? Russia and the Middle East and all that, and Iran. So where do I start? First of all, this is some sort of improvised cooperation, right? It's not something that occurs because both countries actually want to cooperate with the other or see totally identical interests. As you said, right, in Syria, they worked together, but ultimately found themselves playing very different games. And they do have obviously some basic formulas for conducting their foreign relations that are compatible. First of all, I think this is profoundly humiliating for Russia and for the internal prestige of the Russian leadership, that they are now buying relatively primitive military equipment from Iran, which is obviously not a leading producer of military equipment, which is technology that is at the level of the 1950s, right? And that sort of goes to demonstrate that much of the investment in the Russian defense industry was purely facade making, right? It was essentially painting, just like some of those fancy weapon systems that Russia showed off in parades, like this Armata tank that looks like something out of Star Wars, or the Sukhoi 57 stealth aircraft, which also hasn't appeared at all. Most of those projects in the Russian armament industry were obviously fake, and the money was stolen. And that again, or like this Kalashnikov factory in Venezuela that has been paid for 3 times, but has produced precisely 0 Kalashnikov rifles, right? So what we're seeing really is, again, an indicator for this dissolving of Russian political structures, Russian institutions into a neo-patrimonial structure where everything really is privatized and there is very little zero vertical vlasti, right? The power vertical. It's being dissolved into different commercial fiefdoms. And that's, I think, what this cooperation, which is purely coincidental and purely for convenience, that's what this cooperation really shows.
Thank you. Rikard, your comments on it?
Yes, thank you. Yes, I want to echo Jochen. I don't have too much to add, and I completely agree. It is rather embarrassing to be signing with Iran as well. And it's a sign also that Russia has very few friends currently, right? Iran is not someone you want to align yourself with necessarily. But who else is there at the moment, right? We know the traditional alliances and closer with the Shanghai Cooperation and all of these things. The Chinese are taking a bit of caution, at least. But as I mentioned earlier, in the Security Council, you can see the voting patterns are quite interesting, right? The UAE, for example, voted or abstained in the Security Council, but then voted for condemnation in the General Assembly and so on. And we see these, obviously there was a state visit of Mohammed bin Zayed just earlier this week and to Russia, and then yesterday I believe it was announcing the $100 million would go to humanitarian aid in Ukraine and so on. It might seem, but I know that the visit was planned way ahead of the war and so on, but it seems in the same way that the Saudis did very similar things, right? And then offered even more to the Ukrainians. So they're playing both sides in a way, right? And that's the goal of the foreign policy here. I know that the UAE is taking after India with the Indian stance is really they're playing all sides, not wanting to offend anyone and so on, which is why a lot of Europeans predominantly and North Americans were quite disappointed with the Indian stance as well, right, of abstaining and so on in the Security Council. But I think, yes, so I just want to echo what Jochen said. It is embarrassing, and the weapons don't seem, I don't have the same knowledge of their effectiveness and so on, but from what I've seen in Ukraine, it's obviously depending on how many you send in, it is difficult to catch them all. We had a similar situation here with the Houthis attacks in January, February here in Abu Dhabi and in Dubai. Managed to take down most of them, but some will always get through the nets, right? So, but not the same kind of highly technological weapons that NATO are obviously possessing and the Chinese, etc.
Thank you, Rikard. Dennis, your comments on it. I have after your comments are well presented, I will be asking you guys one last questions. I know that I have tried to summarize some of the questions I have received to my inbox. And you have done a very great job trying to answer them. But I don't want to take too much time of you. I know that it's on record time. It's already evening. You're already at the end of your Labor Day. So, Dennis, please just let us know your comment on the previous questions, and now we will say the last one.
Yes, very briefly. Yes, about Iran. Yes. That's true that what Johan said, that yes, Russia have been cooperating with Iran for a long time, especially in Syria, yes, but probably I agree totally with it that we had different goals in Syria. That's why even we had some tensions with Iran during this period. But now, what is going now in Ukraine probably will increase the level and the level of our cooperation, because I suppose that Iran gave us opportunity to use their weapon in change for something more. I don't understand. I don't know what, but nonetheless, I believe in that. But within the framework generally of the Middle Eastern affairs, Russia-Middle Eastern affairs, I should say that it is not only Iran that support Russia. It is obvious that the decision and the agreement between the Russian Federation and Arab monarchies, I mean oil agreement, OPEC plus, is demonstrating us that the Russia is not isolated, and there are a lot of allies for Russia, not in Middle East, but let's say just 2 minutes. Yes, approximately a week and a half. President Putin was talking about the role of Russia in the modern world. Yes, and he addressed a very interesting idea, to my mind, to a lot of countries, Middle Eastern countries, African countries, Latin American countries, Asian countries, that it's high time to make a world really multipolar, and especially with the strengths of countries which used to be in the colonial system. And he was talking a lot about neo-colonialism, yes, and the Russia shall take a leading role to oppose the desire of especially the United States of America to keep world unipolar, yes, and to keep to oppose this desire to oppose this desire of the United States to colonialize, yes, neo-colonialize countries, yes.
Okay, Dennis, thank you very much. I will have one last question. It's a very hard question. I think it's the toughest one. I'm going to ask you very short answers. I know it's unfair, but I don't want to take much more time of you. But how do you think this war will end? I mean, it's a very tough one. But how do you see the end of the current crisis that we're facing right now in Ukraine? Let's go with Jochen. Let's go follow by Ricard, and then again by Dennis, and we'll finish for today. Jochen, the floor is yours.
Well, there's several scenarios that are possible. No? I've sort of wargamed this with some friends. Nothing systematic still, but obviously it's a scenario that I've been looking at for several months. And what we can say with a large degree of certainty now is that Russia will not win this war conventionally, not with troops on the ground. They're going to continue suffering horrible losses as long as they're engaged. They're being outranged by Ukrainian artillery, and they have lost the entire intelligence competition, right? Where obviously Ukraine is getting a lot of support by countries who have very important capabilities in that area. So we're not seeing a Russian conventional victory in any sense. So the question is, what else are we going to see? The question is basically now, how will Russian defeat play out, right? How many civilian deaths will there still be in Ukraine? To what degree, we've sort of alluded to this, to what degree might Iran or other countries be pulled into the conflict? Those are unlikely possibilities, but those are possibilities. In the end, what we're going to see is that Russia has a completely depleted land force, has a largely depleted aerospace force, will largely have depleted its missile force, except for the nuclear missiles. And at that point in time, I believe that in some way the entire thing will wind down to a situation that will either be something like what we had in the Donbas area between 2014 and 2022, like a situation of tension on the borders, perhaps with occasional terror bombardments, basically like the Gaza Strip on a much larger level, obviously, but with a Ukraine that would be much better equipped and obviously ready to retaliate. So not an attractive scenario for Russia as well. So probably we're going to enter a sort of frozen conflict at some point in time. And then the rest of the Russian capability for organized violence will turn inward, as it always has, right? After 1917, for example, after the Napoleonic Wars with the different officer revolts and so on and so on. We're going to see either overt conflict between internal factions within Russia, but I'm speculating, right? It could turn out slightly differently, but something along those lines. Or you're going to see repressions internally with sort of like North Korea turned into a highly repressive state after a non-conclusive conflict on its border. And maybe we're going to, there's an excellent novel out there by Vladimir Sorokin, День опричника, which is The Day of the Guardian. Is it in English? Maybe, I'm not sure, which describes such a scenario and was written like 15 years ago about the descent of Putinism into some sort of regressive, totalitarian, personalist dictatorship. And I think that's a scenario that we could see. And even then, I mean, that's not too bad because Ukraine will be independent and even personalist dictatorships can be deterred. That would be my outlook.
Thank you, Johan. Rikard, your comments on these final questions. How do you think this war is going to end?
Yes, I think, again, I think Joachim put it very well, the different scenarios. I was leaning towards some kind of frozen conflict. I think it can't go on like this for forever, obviously, but it could be a very prolonged conflict and on a much lower intensity, of course. Just to add in an additional one, knowing that, again, there might be some kind of peace brokering attempts from perhaps some Middle Eastern partners who are, again, friendly with both nations in a way. Also unlikely that Ukraine in the current situation would accept any kind of concessions border-wise, and I doubt that Russia would accept anything similar to withdraw completely as well. So the most likely scenario would be, again, low intensity frozen conflict, very prolonged and protracted in some way. And short answer is that I have no idea, but we will see, I'm sure.
No one does. No one does. Thank you very much for your comment, Ricardo. Dennis, your final comments on this matter.
It's so profound question. So really, there are a lot of probable scenarios of the ending of this conflict. But I agree with previous speakers. Yes, that there is a great probability that this conflict could be frozen for a long period. Yes, Jochen told that we are already defeated. Yes, Russia is already defeated in this war. Yes, in this war, but we have enough strength so far. Yes, really, my personal desire. Yes, probably it's not a scientific approach. Yes, but my personal desire to end this crisis as soon as possible. Because if you see my surname, yes. This is the name of one city in Ukraine, in the central part of Ukraine. I'm ethnically Ukrainian. Yes, that's why I want this crisis to be finished as soon as possible. But nonetheless, I'm afraid, and as I told previously, this war is. For Russia, yes, this special military operation or war, like you desire, yes. For Russia, yes, it's straight war. Yes, it's straight war. But for you, yeah, I mean for you, for the Western world, it's a proxy war against Russia. It's totally obvious, and I suppose that. If within several months the big guys, yes, don't get the idea where the whole world is following, yes, this crisis will long for years, for many years, like it was since 2014, yes, since Maidan. That's my idea.
Well, thank you, Dennis. Thank you, Ricard. Thank you, Jochen. You guys have been amazing. I want to know that we are very, very. We have a very strong gratitude for each and every one of you. We hope to have you on campus one day in order to show you the Caribbean side of Colombia. And until the next time, I want to express my gratitude also for the people. More than 50 people that have taken the time to join us during this conversation. And Dr. Ricard Jacobo, thank you very much. Good evening to you in the United Arab Emirates. Dr. Denis Mirgorod, good evening to you also in Russia. And Jochen Kleinschmidt, Dr. Kleinschmidt, thank you very much. And good evening to you also in Germany. Until the next time, bye-bye.
El anterior fue un evento de Cátedra Europa. Suscríbete a Uninorte Académico en YouTube y accede a otros contenidos de la cátedra cuando quieras.